Yeah, welcome everyone. So this is a podcast specifically looking at Michael Fleetwood's legacy, and we joined by two of the kind of legends from the interior architecture course, Paul Harris and Patrick Hannay. So before we start getting into what it's about, um, Paul, if you want to go first and just give a little kind of introduction to yourself, just in case people forgot who you are.
Well, it's a possibility, I guess. It's been a long time. It's been a long time. I'm Paul Harris. I taught on the course just a day a week between 1988 and 2011. And during that period, I was also in practice, and I'm still in practice now with a company called BCHN, which I'm a director in Shrewsbury, but I'm still involved in teaching as well. And I'm head of a relatively new school of architecture in Swansea, which has had a BSc running, a Part One running for several years now, but it's now got its MArch launched, so it's a Part Two there. So I'm still oscillating a bit between education and practice as I used to when I knew everyone who's on this call. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, Patrick.
Yes, I'll try and make this quick. I sort of began in architecture way back in 1967. I did practice when I'd finished. I did urban design. I practiced in France. I worked for DGW in London. I did a research project which was very critical that developed a lot of thinking, and I did 10 years as AJ buildings editor. And the AJ is very important in this story because not only did Mike Fleetwood write for the AJ way back 10 years before when I was a little student, but also that was the first thing I did was pick up the phone and find his address and ask if we could meet in the Architect's Journal. And that was when the die was cast. And eventually Mike rang me up and that must have been about late 1988 and said, I don't suppose you'd ever leave London, would you? And I said, well, why not to come and join a guy like you? So yeah, I joined in 1989 and had the most amazing, never forgotten it, experience for 20 years. And then they booted us out in 2011. And all the way through, I can't remember, yes, nearly all the way through 1996 to now, I was also editor of Touchstone, the Journal for Architecture in Wales. That's enough about me.
Thanks, Patrick. So for myself, like many of the people here, I was a student on the course Interior Architecture, 93 to 96. After finishing, I worked with Mike Cameron, who was one of the lecturers on the course in London for 10 or so years. Was lucky enough to come out in a kind of boom time and the lottery funding project. So I was lucky to work on some nice high profile projects. And then I came back to teach on the course in 2005 to join the team again. And I've just recently left, so 20 years in the university to set up interior design evolution. And I suppose this is how we're all kind of here now. It basically, I sent a message on LinkedIn and everybody was getting back to me. Hi, Craig, have you seen Paul? What's Patrick up to? Is Howard still living in that little flat? Da, 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 and all these kind of conversations. You seen any of the students, whatnot? And then the Lego event at the end in 2013. So it's been a long time. So I decided, okay, let's kind of set up a reunion. Let's see if everybody will want to come to this reunion on in August the 18th, 16th, sorry. And on the back of that, then I thought, well, why do we just do a podcast, to take it right back? And so the podcast really, Mike Fleetwood, as most of you will know, was the start of the kind of family tree of interior architecture. So Patrick's going to take you through a little bit of the kind of CV to background so you can understand where Mike Fleetwood kind of started. And then I'll show a bunch of images to kind of set the scene behind that. So Patrick, if you want to kind of just give Mike Fleetwood's brief CV, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay. I may not have this all right, so Paul, please do jump in. But he began his sort of design architecture thinking career in the Bartlett, that very famous school of architecture. But you need to remember at that time there was a riot going on. There was an absolute battle between neoclassicism and the Beaux-Arts, which was being taught by the majority of the staff, and then a lot of radical teachers and students who actually thought there was something called scientific rationality and the user and participation and goodness knows what else. And they were trying to throw, and by the way, Louis Hellman, the great world architectural cartoonist, was there at the same time. And they were just trying to throw this Beaux-Arts thing out the window, and get down to some serious kind of user-led design and all sorts of other things. So that's inevitably a rumbustious sort of beginning for him. And no doubt he was a troublemaker in the middle of all that as well. I wouldn't be surprised. He also went off, and I think it was for Llewellyn Davis Weeks, went off to the USA. And at the time he was in the USA working for Llewellyn Davis, the Watts riots were going on. And I remember Mike talking to me about this, just, because we don't get many massive burning, well, we do now, but we didn't then get so many riots. But seeing a riot in full flow and seeing the way the blacks were treated and just the brutality of the police, it was a real eye-opener. And he was working in the middle of all that was going on around him, and he never forgot it. And he then came back and for a period, I don't know how long it was, unbelievably, was on the Architects Journal news team, and he was a writer. And if I could just make that link, that's what absolutely, I was a little student in 1960, I don't know what the date was, and I was reading the Architects Journal, and I suddenly came across this piece about the Alton estate in London. I just sat there gobsmacked. I thought, who the hell is this bloke who's written this extraordinary, deep cultural, socio-political analysis of this housing scheme and all its ideas? And I thought, this is amazing. I thought, I never forget this. Anyway, so that's an important link. And then he left the AJ, and he fell out with Peter Davey and over many important issues. Mike just said, I can't stand this. You won't really get politically and culturally involved in the analysis, and he just left. And he got deeply involved in Valley's housing regeneration with a Cardiff practice. And in parallel to all of that, he and his partner, Barbara, became very profoundly involved in community activism within the valleys based on trying to improve everybody's environment. And they were so good at it, Barbara and Mike, that eventually they got to a point where the tenant said, thank you very much. You've been so good to, you now let us see how to do this. We don't need you anymore, which I know was very bruising to Mike at the time. But anyway, so he thought, right, okay. And then by chance, I think, but I may have this wrong, Paul, the job came up for a lecturer in the Cardiff School of Art and Design in what was then the South Institute Glamorgan of Higher Education. And he took it, and within, I don't know, Paul will know this better than me, within quite a short period, sort of somehow then quite quickly became course director. But I think all those very early, you can sort of see why to him architecture and design and its social, political and cultural context was absolutely fundamental. It was in everything that he did and saw around him. And that's why Howard was such an important character. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to that, Paul, in terms of detail.
Yeah, it's really interesting you going back over Mike's story, because well, you knew him much earlier than me, and I met Mike in practice. Actually, he was working for Lochner Cruise Hill when I met him, and I was as well. And we were doing what was called an enveloping scheme down in Rumney, which was a massive kind of scheme on about 200 houses involved, predominantly kind of sorting their external fabric out. And Barbara was working on that as well. So I got to know them both, and that would have been, I think, 1983. He was still working on that when I think from there he moved into the lectureship, because I think it was tough. It was a tough contract to run. I know that, and Mike found that whole interface with the contractors quite profoundly difficult, and it was a tough job. But interesting what you were saying with on the American experience, because I remember him telling me that it was his visit to America that really politicized him. He wasn't really a political person. He described himself prior to that, but the experience of going to the USA and seeing what you've just described, but also seeing the poverty. And, for people who first visit the USA, and I did my first visit, I think would have been around about 78. And when I was traveling down through the southern states, seeing the level of poverty that exists is quite astounding for someone coming from Europe. Maybe Europe's not so good now as it used to be, but you know, it was grim. So from that, I mean, that's how I got to know Mike. And when he took over as course leader, he phoned me up and he asked if I wanted to do some teaching on what was then an interior architecture, interior design course.
Mm.
And I taught in architecture schools, but I never taught interior design. And I really just found it. I mean, he was a good friend, and I just said, well, I don't know if I could teach interior design really. I mean, I'm an architect. I teach architecture, you know. And I said, and I was very glib. I remember I was terribly glib at the time, and I said, "What do you want me to do? Sort of come along and tell everyone to paint things white, you know, which is kind of what architects do as a sort of stock trade." He said, no, no, I've got this real ambition to turn this into an interior architecture course. I'd never heard anyone use that term before, interior architecture. This real ambition to turn this into an interior architecture course and do something that's really engaging and bringing some of the organizational skills that you see in architecture into interior design. So that it would have been in 1988. So I'd known Mike, you know, for about 5 years before coming to the course. Of course, I'd known Howard since 1980, which I'd met him in a different context altogether. And Howard was already teaching on the interior design course before I got there and teaching theory there. So those were the kind of, so when I arrived, I knew both Howard and Mike when I started teaching there, as I say, a day a week back in 88.
If I could just add also, could I just add the just a little an anecdote, because it's, I'm sure, what a lot of the students who knew Mike will also relate to. When I found that address card in the AJ and rang him up, and I said to him, we have to meet, because I read all your articles. And he said, oh, really? And he came to London. And I can remember to this moment him walking through that door into the room I worked in the Architect's Journal. And there was, I've never forgotten it. It was just like I was meeting a long lost brother, you know, and it was just instant. It was a chemistry. It was something emanating from him, which was so strong. And from that, we didn't have to talk about it, you know. We just, yeah, you know where we're both coming from. And I'm sure he emanated this also towards it was. We used to refer to him, didn't we, all, as a great bear of a man, and you know, just the way he greeted you and gave you this enormous bear-crushing hug. There was an amazing sort of passion in there, and a sort of connection of values, which you didn't have to talk about, really. You didn't have to
absolutely.
discuss it too much.
The warmth of the person was incredible, incredibly warm personality, and huge kindness and care and concern, you know, for everyone.
But also tough,
really.
and rigorous.
Yeah. At the same time.
No messing.
At the same time.
Anyway, sorry, Craig.
You used that word then, Patrick, sort of that magnetism, and I think that's a really good word. And I think that's what attracted all these people to him. I think he had these fantastic ideas of how the world should be, how, you know, about society and community, and how people should be educated, and how you should, you know, treat people with respect, but be tough and challenge them. And all those things, I think, resonated with probably all the staff and the students, because he was the first person really that set that up and attracted people like yourself and Paul and Howard. So if I just show a couple of images, because I'm sure, you know, it's been a kind of while, but just so that you can, if you don't know who, you know, these people are we talking about, I can show a couple of kind of images. So for me, that sort of magnetism, so it starts with kind of Mike Fleetwood. He is the kind of the start of it through that, you know, interior architecture course, which was in, you know, mid 80s, let's say, through to 2013. But he starts it, and then Patrick kind of takes it over for a huge chunk of time. And then at the end, Olivia takes it over. And then there's a big gap. And then I'm asked to validate interior design, and then Mike Duncan is now looking after that. So it's kind of 2016 to present. But all the things that have gone through the leaders of the courses and the teams that you will see in a second, Mike Fleetwood's values, as was just described, is right at the core of it. So when we finish these slides, we'll go into some of those things to try to map them out a little bit. So if you did an interior design course in Cardiff, Mike Fleetwood is the kind of the start of it. So this is the iconic image really by Louis Hellman. So Mike Fleetwood, Patrick Hannay, Mike Cameron, Paul Harris, and Richard Sucksmith. So that's an iconic image, and that team was there for quite some time. Then Graham at the back kind of joins the team. There's Howard in the center, and Richard Sexsmith leaves, and then Ellis John kind of takes over. So the team is kind of changing, but the core values come from that kind of legacy that Mike Fleetwood has set up. So the core team then, Paul Harris, Patrick Hannay, Mike Cameron, that's a really core team for many years. And then Charlie and myself kind of joined that team. Great image by the students there. And then we have these kind of events. So summer parties plus Howard's leaving do kind of merge. There's a couple of people on the course, Harry and Paul, that are in a band. So we hijack that. So I'm playing guitar, Charlie's on bass, Patrick's playing keyboards. Somebody creates this huge banner. So we sing a song, Louie Louie, but we call it Howie Howie. Curiously strong intellectual. So if you understand the mint kind of joke here, you always used to hand out these kind of mints. So these events would kind of happen, these massive gatherings. So this is the summer show where Patrick and Paul is leaving. The course has got 2 years to run at this point, and you can see the fantastic quality of the show. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the list of all the people that taught into it. So I've specifically not involved anybody in the image so far that weren't core team, as in they were employed by the university with a contract and we signed it. But this list, and you can zoom in and have a look at it, is pretty much everybody, ex-students, external people, etc., that all taught on the course. So it was this huge kind of family, and they all contributed to this thing really that Mike Fleetwood had set up. Then the team changes then. So Olivia is kind of leading the team then with kind of Heathers, with Sarah and Mike Duncan and Charlie then. But also, me and Patrick are around for a little bit, but not too much at that point. And then when in 2011, when Patrick and Paul leave, we decide to set up this Lego event. So this is leading up to the final gathering. So in 2011, we said, okay, let's create this thing, and we got this Lego piece, the Falling Water, Frank Lloyd Wright, and each person took a piece, and that's a photograph of down the bottom. So there are ex-students, current students, external examiners, all take a piece. Patrick takes the foundation piece, which you can see sticking out of his top pocket. And those are the students, the last 2 years of students. So we think, okay, even though this kind of family is beginning to kind of come to an end, let's make sure that we do one massive party to, commemorate everything, and particularly those students that were kind of dwindling. We then set up this kind of event where, you name it, we had audiovisual stuff, student work, playing videos, people were printing T-shirts, writing into books, and all the rest of the stuff that we were doing. Everybody came back, brought their Lego piece, and then they started to put Falling Water piece by piece back together. There was a bit of drinking going on, so it probably looked a little bit more like Howard Gardens than Falling Water, but nonetheless, I think that was more appropriate. And then there was kind of speeches, but just before the speeches, we had everybody who sent a photograph in, and literally all the memories I could find from Patrick and everybody else, that were all moving on this film towards Falling Water. And then we handed it to Patrick, and then Patrick and various other people did some speeches. And that's Mike Fleetwood down the very bottom there with Mike Cameron and Barb's. And then it moves into interior design. So all that thinking that, was set in motion by Mike Fleetwood, his legacy through all the people we've seen, continued into interior design. So Mike Duncan being an ex-student of the course, and Charlie there, and also now new members of staff like Michael Borlini, And it's still going on today. But the point is, if you did something at Cardiff interiors, Mike Fleetwood was at the absolute kind of core of it. So if we can move to just, I mean, when I kind of was, putting that little slideshow together, it was quite an emotional thing, because suddenly you realize the amount of effort that everybody put in for the kind of students. So if we start to look at some of those critical aspects of the kind of distinctive, unique, and progressive kind of educational experiment, as you called it, Patrick, to kind of chart some of the things that was to do with this Mike Fleetwood kind of legacy and his values at the core of everything. Can we start with kind of teaching team and the people that were kind of involved in it? We've always talked about ourselves having a kind of coreness, but very distinct. Do you want to talk a little bit about
that? I'll start initially, just very briefly. I think the biggest word to me between the team and however it evolved over all the period of time, there was an amazing amount of two things: trust and respect. We were all actually from very different kind of corners, and we did have different views on certain things, but actually we all knew what the core mission was, and we didn't have to debate it very often. Yeah, there were some important moves when were difficult things that we had to sort out, particularly when resources started becoming tight and what you get rid of. But that trust and respect, and that applied, by the way, it's not just between the staff members, but it's absolutely fundamental in relation to the students, because the crit that I mentioned, the critique of crits, and also I did a play with Louis Hellman, which we performed in, and we had 18 characters and just the two of us, was a satire on architectural education. And it was an absolute attack on what was missing in our view. So that sort of and what was missing was often helping the students to lead their design. In other words, getting them to be absolutely articulate and rigorous and analytical, and to try and help them do that so they drove the scheme, and then you'd try and help steer and improve and polish it. But that between the staff team, it was extraordinary. I mean, Howard, when we all left in 2011, said, well, okay, it's a bitter end, but what an amazing experience to have 20 years of teaching with a team of people gradually evolving. But it was all a ball. It was just everybody was throwing in energy like fury, and you didn't have to discuss about too much. Even when we had to change massive things, me going to first year to second year, swaps around, whatever. The trust and respect for the students to take their designs to the highest point.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it's interesting what you say there, because at the time, I was actually doing some teaching with Richard Weston as well up in Leicester, and I'd enrolled for a PhD degree, which is where I'd met Howard, because he was doing research as well. And I was desperately trying to write this thing up. I'd been carrying it around like heavy baggage for a few years, trying to write it and finish it. And I'd taken some time out from work to write it, and then Richard had phoned and said, come and do some teaching in Leicester. So I did that, and then Mike phoned and said, come and do some teaching in Cardiff. And then I found I wasn't writing my PhD again. But it was interesting actually teaching on two different courses at the same time. And I agree with architectural education. It was, I mean, it had huge problems associated with it, and there's a certain lack of kind of freedom associated with it as well. So moving to the art school context was really, I found it incredible liberation, really. I just loved working in a context which was surrounded by people who were doing paintings and sculptures, and just being in a very creative environment, which wasn't like a school of architecture that I went to, which is the Welsh School of Architecture, which was like in an engineering block. I found that extraordinary, and I knew Mike. As I say, I knew Howard. I'd met you before, Patrick, when I was at the Welsh School of Architecture briefly, yeah. When you met myself and John Carter years before.
Yeah.
But it was kind of it was sort of like we'd found each other really in this context, and it was really magical because I think the connection was incredible. And although we shared the values, we'd all kind of arrived at those values by different routes, but there was a huge kind of commonality in what we cared about and the way that we wanted to do things. And I think there was then this evolution of this idea, this constant discussion about, well, what is interior architecture? How is it different to interior design? How is it different to architecture? Where is it positioned? How does it work? What ideas can you bring from architecture to this interior architecture? What ideas do you bring from the kind of classic, interiors courses that you bring into this? It was a kind of ferment of ideas, and I sort of I loved the whole period, like you. I mean, I thought it was an amazing kind of privilege to be involved with it for that period of time. And like you say, Mike was kind of, he was the man who really conducted it and put it together.
Yeah. I think also that I'd like to emphasize that thing about the art school, because if I'd been asked to come and teach in an architecture school, I'd have refused. I wouldn't have gone anywhere near it. And to me, the trouble, and this has changed massively now, it's changed massively. But again, to me, architecture, all the stuff I saw in student schemes and also what was being done never seemed to get anywhere near the things that really mattered to users in a building. The sections were there, the plan was brilliant, the light was brilliant, but actually the stuff of living and the stuff and the furniture and the interior and the things that made people, I mean, people spend most of their time inside buildings. We don't spend our time ogling at the elevation, and that was all missing. And then interior design was also very rarely looking at architecture, looking at the host building and really wanting to analyze it and understand its history. So the two were sort of blind passing each other. And I think it was Mike's brilliant sort of perception, which I kind of absolutely synced with, that no, these things need to be rammed together. You need the fantastic rigor and spatial analysis, whatever, of architecture, but then you need design. And the great thing about design culture is that it starts with the culture of the client and the users. The designers always began with, now look, guys, we really need to understand what these guys are about. And architecture never began with that. They began with something much more abstract. And Mike had this vision of ramming these two cultures together. And from that would become something really special.
I think that's where the whole idea of narrative kind of developed, that whole idea of, what is the client's position? What do we imagine these people, what is the ethos that underlies it? You're right, because architecture kind of, particularly in schools of architecture, kind of arrives with its own agenda in a way. It's kind of predefined. And there's a lot that can be taken from that kind of tradition and used, as you say, about the kind of rigor, about organizing, about how you might plan things, certain aspects of it, how you might create positive spaces, the intervention methodology in architecture as well. But there's a whole richness in interior design, which is also to do with being close up, not looking at the plans and the sections, but actually being close up and thinking about what the door handle is like, what what you actually touch, what the materials are like, which is kind of secondary in most schools of architecture. That is kind of secondary. Sorry, Craig, you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, and I think, again, that's very much Mike Fleetwood, where, interiors, they're much more intimate. You sit in them, you belong in them, and I think that kind of sat very well with his kind of, outlook on life, rather, as opposed to a piece of architecture you just look at, and these things were about people, and it was about the human condition, which was where I think he was absolutely just excelled at. Can you touch on a little bit, because it was interior architecture, validated 92, it could have been interior design, it could have continued, but no, there was this shift into something, and it was, as far as I'm aware, Patrick, it was the first interior architecture course. So tell us a little bit about that. What was the conversations around its interior architecture? Was that up for grabs? Did he go, no, it's definitely going to be this?
Well, we had to write the claim that you were constantly having to sort of write new course documents, and no doubt that some shift in higher education at the time also forced us to really put down on paper what it was all about. And I think It is it's a very tricky territory because, and I don't think we shouldn't get too sidetracked by it. But maybe I'll just introduce this bit, which is the interesting man, which many of you may know, Fred Scott, who was teaching at Kingston. And Kingston was an absolutely outstanding interior design course. And Fred Scott had this position. He kept because we were having conversations with him and we were talking with all these people, what should we do? And this is how we're going to do this. And Fred would keep saying, no, don't do that, Patrick, because interior design has a noble history. And we shouldn't undermine it by calling it interior architecture. And I fundamentally disagree with him. But what was funny was that we were both, I mean, Fred stuck to interior design, but actually Fred was doing what we were also exploring in parallel. And all those characters, Julian Powell-Tuck, Ben Kelly, Fred Scott, they were all trying to deal with this stuff with the host building and the narrative and the culture and trying to blend. So he just had this, he thought we were doing a sort of status and a sort of competitive market take to try and improve the status. And my problem about, I certainly, and I've discussed this with Mike Fleetwood and a lot, was that the words that we used for dealing with existing buildings in architecture were refurbishment, retrofit, rehabilitation. They're all horrible words. And if you just said to people, well, oh, and the AJ is still doing it. There's this absolute passion for retrofit. It's a horrible word. I mean, it just doesn't. So we kept saying, look, these students, if we said I'm an interior architect or I'm doing interior architecture, suddenly there's a real status thing. And it's not just status just to look self-inflated. It's status because we are dealing with the host building and we are part of the design game. And somehow we need to bring those two together. So we had to put it down in writing and try and argue it through. And it does, yeah. So
yeah, I
whether
think
that explains it.
coming in on that as well. I mean, my experience of going to see interior design courses before we changed it to interior architecture, I only kind of saw them, I wasn't participating in it, was they tended to be focused on smaller interiors. Typically the brief would be sort of shop fit out, boutiques, commercial works, small scale with an emphasis, you know, as the name suggests, on the interior. I think what Mike did was he kind of took on big buildings. So our students by the third year were actually kind of remodeling very large buildings with kind of a lot of spatial skills to go in and see how they could be completely reinvented, completely changed. And I think that was a huge expansion of the skill base compared to interior design that I had seen operating prior to then. I think that was a really big shift. I mean, I remember coming down and the third year were converting huge warehouses down the docks into cinemas, etc. You know, I thought, wow, that's, and of course that dealing with buildings of that size and that scale gives you incredible spatial opportunities as well. So it carried with it all the emphasis on materials, etc. But all of a sudden there were big organizational challenges for students. And as you say, the emphasis was not on finding a form, because the form was there, the form was given. So that wasn't the challenge. It was actually reinventing the space, supplemented, as you say, with all the other considerations that we had with, you know, the ethos of the space, etc. So that focus, I think, on certainly reworking and reinventing large buildings, I think was quite radical at the time. I mean, I couldn't just say for sure. I mean, you might have more familiarity with a wider range than me on that.
And to me, it was, I would have to say it's fantastically radical, because you're talking about 1992. And we were saying, actually, the thing that's really important for the future of this climate and the buildings and where we're working is that we need to reuse what
Absolutely.
exists.
Absolutely.
And we were saying, nobody else was listening to this at the time.
We were saying that in 88 even.
Yeah.
I mean, we were actually saying it in 88 and it was extraordinary.
So it's extraordinary. And then it was obvious when I was able to introduce a lot of stuff to do with all the climate change and building performance and fabric and teaching and going to visit energy efficient buildings and all that stuff. And when I talked about that, shall we do this, Mike? He said, of course it is, because you know, that's being just incredibly responsible. So the students are articulate, so that we've only got 3 years, guys. We've only got 3 years of intense learning. So we need to make sure these students can go in any direction afterwards. But much more important than that, it was signaling that we're not actually up for what, to me, a part of the interior design profession is about, which is about extravagance.
Yeah,
The elite
yeah,
and lots
yeah,
of money, and people who've got excess capital to burn, and that it was actually about saying, no, actually we need to retrofit these buildings because that's carbon, in carbon sense it's right, but also it's reusing what we exist. And it's not about extravagance, it's about being careful with resources, and that real skill of knowing where to put the real points of delight, into the scheme so that they shone. And that was it. You have to admit that historically it's taken, and the profession is still catching up. It's still
yeah,
catching up.
yeah, yeah. And the thing as well with that carries with that is that we generally encourage students not to pick buildings that were too precious because they would be restricted, listed buildings or buildings that were highly cellular. I remember something coming along with sort of a fort or Martello Tower or something, and thinking, well, what can you do with it? How can you? So that idea of repurposing, which is, I don't think is a word we used back then, but it's a word that everyone is using at the moment, this idea of repurposing buildings, reinventing buildings. And also there was the idea that also lay behind it about preserving the built environment rather than just demolishing it. And that has a kind of real resonance with people as well, to see things preserved and reused. I think most people feel instinctively that's a good thing. It maintains a degree of, coherence in the built environment as they know it, but also it is that kind of idea of reinvention plus preservation. It's those two things going hand in hand. So,
Yeah. And I do remember back in the HA day when I was a buildings editor, I remember meeting Michael Braun, and many of you won't know who he was, but he was a really interesting teacher, architect, and everything. And he was the man, probably more than anybody else, who was trying to say to everybody, there's a guy down in Italy called Carlo Scarpa, who you really ought to pay attention to. And he
yeah,
was just not being listened to. He
no,
was just not being
no,
listened to. They just thought, what is this guy who's been spending 15 years fiddling about with some castle on the edge of the river, kind of, when he's not even an arch. I mean, what's he doing? And it's still, of course, there were a few really bright sparks within the architecture profession, mostly involved with education, who knew of Scarpa's significance. But I mean, it was obvious to us, and everybody who taught on the course, yeah, just knew what that character was about, and a load of other ones with him,
yeah, absolutely. I
And that was
mean,
so strange. So it was, yeah, it was. And by the way, I have to say that at the time when we were doing it all, I have to say that a lot of what I've just said over the last minute or two is sort of looking back and making sense of it. I'm not sure we were totally at the time thinking, wow, this is really radical stuff.
yeah,
We're just
no,
doing
no, it's 2020, is it?
we
2020
were,
hindsight.
but we were just doing it because that's
Yeah,
drove us. And it I have to link it to this business of the way we educated, because to me, you maybe as students remember it, but we were always trying to push you, A, to be really articulate about what your intentions were, really analytical, and also to be able to do that visually and wrap up in a brief 5 minutes. This is my analysis of the culture, the building, the clients, the etc. This is the place. This is my moves. This is what I explored. Chuck, 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 chuck. And that was, so that the scheme could be driven by the student.
yeah.
We would
And I,
then add our experience.
and I think as well, talking about a synthesis of values, with Howard doing the theory side,
Yeah.
there was his way of teaching, which was about thinking, attention to detail, kind of precision in writing. All of these words were synonymous with the way that we taught in the studio as well. There was a real coming together, I think, of the theoretical positions and the practical positions, and they were both, running hand in hand through the
What I
course.
also find very strange is I always thought Howard's series, I mean, I know they were tough and that he sets out, I used to say to Howard sometimes, "You're not really asking a first-year student to engage with this in week 2, are you?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why?" And he'd say, "Well, you know, they would go off the deep end, but they'll get it. They'll get it."
Yeah.
And but what was extraordinary about Howard, I don't remember Michael or Paul or myself sitting down and talking to Howard and saying, "Oh, by the way, what you need to put into those seminar and lecture series is this, this, and this." We just looked at him and said, "Great, we can see where you're coming from." When all those things that Howard put into videos and talks and discussions, we knew how it was feeding in. He didn't have to adjust anything. He just did what he did.
Yeah.
But we knew it was reinforcing everything that we were trying to do in the studio.
But that merging between theory and practice, I think, was very strong. And some people's projects and the 10,000-word dissertation kind of dovetail together. So it seemed to me like everybody was on the kind of same page, and what you wanted was thinking practitioners, really. So that wasn't just kind of dealing with aesthetics, it was dealing with all the kind of issues. You mentioned that word kind of precision earlier, and I just wonder whether the one thing that I took a lot from, when Mike Fleetwood put together the modules of, analysis, conceptualization, then development, synthesis, tectonic, so detailing, putting things together tectonically, and then the communication. It seemed to me that that was just a beautiful thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was an extraordinary thing that happened because, and I don't know which students on this call will remember it, but there was that really difficult period when we moved out of being South Glamorgan Institute of Higher Education, we moved into UIC, and UIC started thrusting modularization on us, and then they also, by the way, cut the number of weeks in the year that we could teach, but let's leave that aside for a moment. And Mike actually said, "Look, the only way I'm going to have," because modularization could have killed the course. It could have, and it was killing a lot of design courses all over, because modularization is a nightmare, chopping things up into cake bits.
It's the enemy of design, isn't it?
It's the enemy of design. And Mike said, "I can't cope with this while teaching flat out." He said, "Can you leave me 3 months?" I think it was 3 months. He said, and at that point, he brought in Oliver Lewis and Uncle Zero to teach first year while he was away. And he came up with this absolutely, totally brilliant, it sounds terribly obvious and simple now, but he said, "Okay, so on every project and everything we do, the design process will make the modules. So the design sequence process, those are going to be the 5 modules." And it was a brainwave because it was that framework. It allowed every year and every brief and every project, you could pick bits of it. I mean, we actually did fool the authorities. I mean, they couldn't work out what we were doing. But the students knew it because we used to give them self-assessment sheets. And they could see which went to what module, etc., like that. So, but it was Mike's genius to make the design process the titles of the modules, and we knew once we got that we could just knit what we were doing into the modules. And I remember when we used to go to examination meeting with other members in the university, they used to, "What is this analysis and conceptualization? How do the students understand it?" And we just kind of batted it away, but because I think most of the students did sort of get it. And they didn't have to, but it was clear in what we were assessing, I think. And it was Mike's genius in doing that. And he was also wise in saying, "I need 3 months to sort this out," or 2 months. I can't remember whether it was 2 or 3. But it did also bring in Oliver and Uncle Zero, and they did something extraordinary while Mike was away. Oliver Lewis, it was his sort of driving, just in first year, was the idea that you could actually, if you really were clear about what any brief that you were setting a student to do was focused on, a series of fragmented ideas, you could get people to design something in a week and draw it and present it in 1 week. And it also required everybody to be in the studio and everybody to be flat out. And he wasn't willing to accept that you couldn't draw it by the end of the week. And people say, "Oh, well, how do I draw it beautifully by Friday?" No, you can do it. And they did. They did it. And I mean, I remember you know, you're saying we got to, I remember him doing this thing about week 3 or 4. And, you know, I mean, it takes a lot of architecture students sort of years to be able to, at that time, never mind computers, draw properly with a pen, you know, and Oliver and I said, well, we can do this in a week. And we can get students at the end of a week to come out with the most spectacular, accurate, beautiful. They understood a line, they understood its weight. Yeah, yeah. And so everything was that wonderful ramp up of what you can do if you really are clear about what you're trying to achieve in each bit of the project, and bring all those fragments together, gradually layering on top of each other. And it was that drive and energy, and you could only do it with studio presence. It's the only way you could do it. And I mean, Oliver used to only appear on a Friday. I think he used to maybe, I can't remember whether he only appeared on a Friday or whether he appeared on a Monday. But
I think it was Friday because he was usually there the first year and I was there in the
yes,
third
he
year
was in
because
first year,
I
yeah.
used to come down on Friday.
And him and Uncle Zero, what was Uncle Zero's real name?
I can't remember. Uncle Zero. I thought that was his real name, wasn't
Uncle
it?
Zero.
He went to Taiwan, apparently. He's made a fortune.
But they were absolutely, and the students just so responded to it. It was just amazing. And I'm sure if you brought in a group of architecture students from the architecture school and said, look what these guys have done. This is week 3, guys, and look what these guys are drawing. And they go, wow. You know, and it's the same when building, you know, the idea, I don't know whether you can ever remember the Scorfidio Dilla television screen and the structure.
I can,
It was a
yeah.
brilliant thing because
Yeah.
in that one
Yeah.
thing, they learned to do one-to-one details. They learned how to make beautiful models, and they learned how to actually think about what is this weird object that's neither furniture nor what the hell is it? And you
I
know,
mean, that was the interesting thing, the way the first year was really restructured, because I remember when I came, and I don't know what students are all on the line at the moment, but I remember when I came, they all used to have to design for their first project a mausoleum, which was in the style of an architect, you know. So they all sort of had to do it as Robert Venturi or Mies van der Rohe or whatever. They had to do this little mausoleum and try and kind of get into the grain of what that architect might do and understand the philosophy and present it. But it was very deterministic, you know. It was kind of turned out little Mies van der Rohes or little Le Corbusiers at the end of it. So then I remember this whole thing about the first year, which I wasn't involved with, but I recall it being broken into a series of very focused exercises, as you described, which were building skills, but also kind of building ways in which you could think about design and think about design process. I think it was a really powerful set of projects that came through.
yeah, it was
Amazing.
very,
It was an amazing foundation, amazing
yeah.
foundation, you know.
And we should say, by the way, which we've not mentioned before, we do need to remember the context in which we're working. The majority of students at that early stage were still coming through foundation art courses, fundamental.
Yeah.
They had been thrown into this pool of
Yeah.
just be creative with any medium, on any way, on any form. And they arrived at us with actually a lot of them being quite sophisticated, really. That's fantastic. That was very good. And then the other crucial thing was they all had grants from the government.
Yeah.
They didn't have to have loans.
Incredibly crucial.
So
Incredibly
absolutely
important.
crucial. And then we had a lot of weeks before we were thrust into UIC. And I remember that terrible moment when somebody said, you know, you've got to cut 4 weeks or 5 weeks out of the course. And we said, what? 5 weeks? That's 5 projects.
Yeah.
You know,
But that thing
it.
about student grants is so critical, because, you know, students come out with such extraordinary debts now. But not just that. I mean, if you haven't got if you have a grant, then you can really immerse yourself in your education, because you don't have to worry about where the money's coming from. But for most students these days, you know, education means doing work to put yourself through. So that kind of, it splits their time, it takes their time away. So, you know, that degree of focus we had back then, I don't know if it's viable today with the pressures, the financial pressures that are on students these days, which are really onerous, you know.
And the other actual key quality, if I could just add one more, which was very much Mike, is this business about seeing is believing. So it's absolutely determined that on every front we'd be constantly getting out of the college and going to see
Buildings.
interiors,
Yep.
energy things, visits, and you met hopefully the designers, met the architect or whatever. But getting out, seeing is believing, because he knew that only, the danger of a lot of architecture education, you were just in this sort of strange vacuum, and you had to get out and put yourself in front of this stuff. And John Carter, some of you will remember him in the early days, taking people around just to understand the fundamental materials of which buildings are assembled and
Yep.
why they are the way they look. And also all those visits to interiors done by really key practices. And sometimes we went to see the practices themselves and talk to them about it. It was so fun. That seeing is believing is, and Mike used to go on about this.
But you had amazing contacts as well through
Well, that was useful.
your experience with the AJ, because
Yeah.
I remember, I used to come down on a Friday and I'd say to students, what you've been doing. Oh, Patrick took us up and he showed us this kind of new gallery with the sort of dinosaur gallery in the V&A. And then we went to meet this architect, Ian Ritchie, and he showed us all the drawings. And look, he's given us all the drawings. I was thinking, that's extraordinary. I mean, Ian Ritchie is such a prominent architect. To have that kind of introduction and I'm sure the students at the time didn't realize how extraordinary that level of access was for them at the time. It was a kind of amazing thing to do, I think.
And it was also a crazy commitment by the students and the staff, because to get to these places, we were leaving at God knows what hour of the morning to get there, and long drives and going all over the country. I mean, we got to Nottingham, we got to goodness knows where. And John Carter would take people all over the bloody place.
Yes.
In these vans, which we self-drove. I don't know who was driving the second or third van. I was trying to work that out the other day.
These students, Patrick.
Well, I know, but then I was thinking, how do we do that in safety and health and safety?
One last thing on it, really, that I think is very important, because we talked a bit about architecture there. But the one thing I loved when I started teaching there was the students would introduce me to stuff I'd never heard of. Coming out of an architectural culture, I mean, I didn't know anything about people like Ron Arad or Joe Colombo, all these design icons, it didn't really kind of permeate the field of architecture somehow. So, having students talk to you about those characters and those influences, that was an extraordinary education for myself. And education is always two ways, I think. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from the students.
Well, thanks both. Let's throw it open, see if anybody wants to kind of ask a question or say anything. I mean, there's quite a few people kind of online, so if you kind of want to ask anything, ask away.
I was just going to say something.
Jonathan,
Hi. I was just picturing, how horrendous it was during the lockdown, and just thinking, how tough it must have been running a course through that period. And just I wonder how Mike might have dealt with that idea as well, and that whole precedent, really, which it's just been set now, hasn't it, for people just being so used to working at home, or the poor students during that time just having to sit in their student houses. And how on earth can you transpire all that knowledge that you guys have got to those poor chaps who spent a couple of years really doing it?
I think
huge culture shift, I think, through the COVID. It's very difficult, I think. I mean, we were saved by gadgets like this one. Zoom and Teams in particular was hugely useful, to carry on teaching. And I don't know if you were in at the beginning when I was talking about, I bought a little sort of one of these cameras on a stand so I could put my sketchbook underneath it. So if I was doing tutorials, I could, people could see me draw as I did in the studio. I try to kind of mimic the way that I taught in the studio, but remotely. But it's interesting. I think what's come out of that, and I don't know if it's a general perception, but where I'm teaching at the moment, I think that people came back into the studios, and I think the biggest thing that they missed was that whole ethos of collaboration, which is so important in design. Just working together, being supportive of each other. You know, group design seemed very difficult to kind of organize again. People weren't sort of interacting with each other as they would normally. So that took a while, I think, and I'm not sure we're still out of it, because, you know, we're kind of still getting youngsters coming through that, you know, they're in school and, you know, they're working at home and they were working on teams and they were working remotely, and it was kind of a period of real isolation. So
Yeah,
no,
it's quite ingrained, stays quite
yeah.
ingrained.
So whilst I think, as Richard was saying when we were just talking before coming on air, as it were, that you know, the technology was brought forward hugely, I think, you know, using these systems that we're using today. But at the same time, you know, the social aspect of education was kind of, you know, went into free fall, really.
Yeah.
I think you
I think
could
just to answer, can I just answer the question in relation, because Jonathan was asking how would
How would Mike do with it?
Well, exactly. Mike
Yeah.
Mike wouldn't touch a computer, right? Yeah. So thank God for Ellis John and for Charlie Bull, because they were absolutely unbelievably committed and skilled to getting all the students to really grapple with all that. Mike just, yeah, he would have freaked out. I think he would have just said, no, I'm not doing this. You know, I'm not going on Zoom.
I'm out of here.
I'm out of here.
I think it'd be more the case that he wouldn't be able to do it than not want
No,
to do it.
Yeah.
no.
No, and it wasn't his thing. If I could say about
We didn't have the internet back then,
no.
Teams.
No. And the group thing was really interesting, because another Mike introduction in first year, and it only lasted, I think, for about 3 or 4 years. But he had this extraordinary friend, and I wish I could remember his name, before the wonderful Roy Grindrod came and down and got everybody to really be really good at drawing, sketching. We had this performance theatre psychologist who was brilliant. He did a whole week with the students, just making them do all sorts of weird exercises and games in the studio to cement that you're all part of this. You need to learn how to work together and help each other and do things. And he invented, I mean, I would used to watch around. I thought, what is this guy up to? But it was chemistry. It was amazing stuff. And it was about building the group strongly. And then from then on, just saying, please, guys, be in the studio. Because in the end, you know, you teach yourselves a lot. A lot of the teaching goes on between you all being in the studio and talking to each other. And okay, I guess you can do it now by all being on WhatsApp, all being on Zoom. But I don't know how many conversations go on between students actually with their schemes now. I don't know how much that goes on, whether they can easily discuss their schemes. Whereas before, you know, all you had to do was sort of look over your shoulder at the student behind you or wander around and talk about it. So I don't know whether that goes on now.
I think it's just a complete shift of how we did it, Jonathan, to ask you a question, because I taught through that kind of period, which was kind of tough. But the one good thing about it was that you were left alone to do the teaching. And so there wasn't anybody kind of meddling with your stuff, because you could just go, I'm not filling in that form. I need to teach this. So from that point of view, it actually worked. All the social stuff was hard work, because obviously, you know, we're human beings, we need that social interaction. But if a lot of people had techniques of how to do it using technology to do it, obviously Teams was there, and it was the kind of beginning of Teams. But actually, what was the thing that the students that would normally be a bit more nervous and a little bit more kind of not kind of mixing with everybody, those guys excelled. Absolutely excelled. Those people that would perhaps struggle to come in and talk and all those things. But if you had the right techniques, you could do it. I mean, but you couldn't have done it with, you know, if you just dropped the pandemic back in '96, all universities would have ceased to exist. There's no doubt about that, because there was nothing set up at that point. So the social stuff was bad, but actually you could do the teaching fairly successfully. At least I found that anyway. My students produced probably better work than the few previous because they had no distractions.
Mm.
They weren't going out, they weren't doing this. And so they were just concentrating on what they were doing. And I could be better because I wasn't being misdirected also into all these different rooms with different people where I could just kind of be with the student. So there was pros and cons, but it wasn't impossible.
But you can't do seeing is believing, because you can go on Google Street Map and stare at the outside of buildings for all you want, but you can't do seeing is believing and go inside
Yeah.
No,
and touch the stuff and really do it. So you were locked out of all of that, which seems to me sort of extraordinary. I do remember, just to remind people, and this was again another thing, and we had to lose it because we couldn't afford it. That extraordinary going down to Alan Zoftig's factory, who was a brilliant leading furniture maker and who allowed the students to come to the factory. And in a couple of days, all the students produced the design for a chair, and then the best one was chosen. And they spent the week actually making it within his factory. And I mean, that was just an extraordinary sort of experience. And to also focus on saying the chair is important. We sit on it, you know, where most of us, listen, you're all sitting down at the moment. This chair is vital. It's as important as the section and all the rest. So that was an amazing thing. We had to give it up, I think, because Alan Zoftig, we had to pay Alan. And in the end, there were all sorts of cuts and money, and we couldn't do it.
I think that the one thing I can't remember if it was you, Patrick, or somebody else saying, and somebody told you, I think, which ties in with that was, okay, get the 1-to-1 right and get the 1-to-50 right.
Well, this was Stephen Donald. Well,
Right.
no. It's 1-to-1, 1-to-1, and 1-to-500. This was his, you know, 1-to-500, you get the strategic moves right, and then get down to 1-to-1, or 1-to-10, or 1-to-5. But everything in between was just filler, he used to say. Everything in between was just filling it out. But get the 1-to-500 and get the 1-to-5, you're on.
Let's take another question. You can unmute yourselves, apparently. So if anybody
I've
wants
got
to
a question.
Yeah.
Sketching, I think, Patrick, I can't remember the guy's name, but we had a guy,
Roy Grindrod.
I think it was, yeah, and he taught us all about shadows. Do you remember all that skyography?
Diagraphy.
Yeah. So my point on this is what we find is the young people who come to work with us, they just can't sketch. I mean, it seems like about, I don't know, 15 years ago, it became, you know, less and less and less until the point, I don't know whether anyone else on this call experienced the same, but now there's only like me and one other guy who's also about 50 years old who can sketch. So what happened in education? Did it
I think
did it
it's a
just all
really,
go computer and
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. I think it's really interesting. I kind of recall just a few years back doing a scheme, and I'd done some hand drawings for a client. They were sort of, you know, they were sketches with Pantone and felt pen, and the client liked them, and he said, could you produce the whole package like this, because it's much easier for people to understand, and they don't feel put off about asking things because it doesn't look finished
it's
like
not
a computer thing. It's
complete.
done,
Yeah.
you know. So I remember going back to the practice, and a couple of young guys there said, we've got to push this out freehand. Of course, they couldn't sketch, like you say. They just couldn't sketch because, I mean, they're brilliant on computers. They could do things on computers I couldn't even imagine doing, but you know, but they couldn't. But it's quite interesting in our practice now. We've tried to get youngsters to sketch, to get that skill, because I think it's a really important skill, and I think it's coming back. Actually, I think people are just a little bit fed up of glossy CGIs. You know, they want something which is a bit
100%.
looser in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think it is coming back, and it's it is a great skill. Of course, the thing with computers, they are just so incredibly powerful, aren't they? I mean, I remember being in School of Architecture, you just had to leave sort of like 4 days to draw it all up. Well, you remember having to draw the damn thing up physically.
But I
And
think it's not really the drawing up side of it I was thinking about. I was thinking the concept stage.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
the
yeah,
idea.
yeah,
So
yeah,
our
yeah.
clients, I mean, huge, big clients, that they're more seduced by the sketch and the
Yep.
fact it's not a fait accompli. It's not a
Yeah.
ta-da, there it is.
It invites you in,
Photorealistic.
doesn't it? A sketch invites you in. A
Yeah.
CGI says, "Here it is."
Yes,
It's delivered.
absolutely. And we just find, as I say, that there's just very few of us who can do it.
Yeah.
But
I think it's
what's interesting, Nick, is that I would say that most of the, well, let's say the ones who are 40 and upwards, who are known within the design and architecture profession, the really all the leading ones do all draw and sketch.
The trouble with it, Patrick, is they're too expensive. From a commercial perspective, you can't have someone of that caliber because they're just too expensive within the within the practice. That's what we find. So you really need someone who's 25 years old, like we were 25 years ago, who could do it, and we just haven't got it. So it's a problem.
And Michael Cameron would add that to him, which was he used to rail about this, was the gradual crucifixion of foundation art courses.
Yeah.
Because they just became less and less and less and less and less good. And that was where students, they drew everything, you sketched everything, and you could explore any medium, anything that you were making through sketching and drawing and painting.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Michael was so passionate about. I mean,
was.
he could have written a thesis about the destruction of foundation art courses, and he was right. He was absolutely right. Because you remember, I mean, he could draw, he could just sketch anything beautifully. I mean, his pen,
draw like an angel.
Draw like an angel. Yeah.
I think the thing with sketching is quite a difficult thing to sell to students, and God, we've tried, because the pencil, it's a kind of mighty thing. But when they see the computer and they see that gloss that comes out of it, and I've seen even like last week, people are getting portfolios and sending me their portfolios. Craig, can have a look at this. And the only comment back on both portfolios, put more sketches in, not a single sketch.
Yeah.
And there's a podcast in that, Nick.
Yeah.
I think there is.
Yeah.
I think there is a podcast.
No, do you remember the Monday morning not meetings? We had a 1 hour project.
1 hour project.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
And I mean, it forced you. The only medium really there was no computer. So you had to sketch it. Come up with an idea in an hour, and that's what we need people to do. There's just, as I say, there aren't not in our business anyway, and as far as I can see, not in my contemporaries' businesses. There's no one who can do it. So, yeah, a plea out to Craig: if you're still doing what you're doing, please foster any seeds of talent that are out there and get them. I think it's confidence. I think that people can sketch, but it's fostering that confidence to be able to do it. And Roy, did it certainly with my cohort.
Yeah, and he did it in week 2.
Yeah, it was very early on.
Very
it was pencil. It was it was shadows, learning how light plays off objects, and it was brilliant. I'll never forget it. It was.
What's interesting that even I taught for a bit up at the M Arch up at CAT, up at the Centre for Alternative Technology, where they had an M Arch, and they, even at MA level, they got Chris Loyne, who's absolutely unbelievable with a pen and watercolor, in at week 1 in there, and they forced them all to go out into the landscape of CAT and just draw, and that's amazing to have to do that at MA level.
Well, I remember you, Patrick. I remember I was there 89 to 92. So I remember the first CAD sort of machines coming onto the studio floor. I can remember there's a couple of them, and everybody wanted to use them. Everybody wanted to have a go. And I can remember you, Patrick, saying, absolutely not. You're not, until you can draw on that drawing board, you're not going in that room. And you're like,
well, because the fundamental reason why, and you can see it all over the place, is until you had actually put your pen to draw understood the difference between a 0.1, 0.2, 0.5, 0.8, whatever it does, because then you would just draw dumbly on a computer.
Yeah.
You need to actually feel it.
It was the right thing, because as you mentioned earlier, people can't draw, and as you know, I've moved into more sort of creative agencies, so it's more sort of graphic design, I suppose, than architecture now. But even now, graphic designers come out of uni and they can't sketch. They can do great stuff on Illustrator, they can do great stuff in Photoshop, they can do, but they just can't draw. They can't physically sketch, which is frightening, really.
I think the difficulty with computers as well is they're so demanding. You know, you have to make a decision down to a millimeter. Whereas a sketch, you know, if you've got a felt pen, you know, your line weight's half a meter wide anyway. So you don't have that kind of constraint in your thought about how you conceptualize something. If you try and do it, some people do. I've got to say, I see youngsters coming through, and they use the computer as a design facility. I can't do it without having sketching next to me. You know, I just can't do it.
And I think that the other thing is, I suppose, when you're using a computer, they know that if the weight of the line is too much, it's very easy to change. But you've got to, when you're sketching or drawing, you've got to think about it before you do it.
That's one of the things I think that is quite good about a computer, because I say I do sketching, but often I get someone to do a wire drawing for me, so I get the perspective right, so I cheat. But you know, there is that thing when if you're in a school of architecture, you spent a sort of day doing a perspective, and you've kind of put your your wash on it, etc., and you look at it and you think, God, if only I'd done that like 6 foot to the left. Well, you can't, because you've got that drawing now. But you know, with a computer, you can just set your position. So I think what we see, and what would be good to see, is a more interaction between computers and freehand. You know, kind of working between those two things. But
can I add one further just item in before we lose it? I do want to also remind everybody about another tactic that Mike Fleetwood put in place, which was he absolutely insisted that any external examiner was a leading practitioner who did it. We weren't having any of these academics coming in from other interiors courses and friends of the course and other friendly academics. No, they were top line. When you look at the list of who were those external examiners, by the way, they were all examiners who did understand the difficulties of education. They weren't complete outsiders, but I mean, Julian Wickham, an outstanding designer. Michael Cameron was an early one. Ben Kelly was an external examiner. Tim Malloy, who eventually ran all the Science Museum. Richard Murphy, probably the most famous architect in Scotland and hero of Carl Scott, etc. Stephen Donald, an absolutely outstanding interior, and Sadie Morgan, who was the last external examiner. Who's, well, I mean, if you just Google Sadie Morgan and see what she's done. And interestingly, she's become such a huge person in architecture, but actually she was trained in interior design at the Royal College of Art.
That's right. Yeah.
And you know, they were all our external examiners, and we were determined that these people should really know the business, and that we hoped that students would really look up to them and think, well, if this guy thinks, you know, in the conversation, and we have a good conversation about this, then this is setting the standards really high.
Interesting what you say about Sadie, you know, sort of degree in interior design, and as we know, she's actually involved in massive infrastructure projects.
Yep.
You know, it's
absolutely
extraordinary.
Every scale.
That thing about the external examiners, that kind of very progressive high standards that were kind of set from the outset by, you know, and that is part of kind of Mike Fleetwood's kind of legacy, fed right through to the studio culture, where you had practitioners coming in, so you had something to aspire to. That built a whole studio culture, the way the studio was laid out. You know, the students had their own desk, the staff office was right in the location in the middle. There was huge amount of books everywhere. There was the notice board with everything on. All those things felt part of that kind of community, that kind of family, without having those things in place. All those building blocks, I think, that were largely put in place by Mike Fleetwood and developed by everybody that I showed on that image. You know, that's what kind of that's his legacy. I think that's what, you know, runs right the way through from mid 80s to kind of now. And anybody who did that course all contributed to it. Even if you just asked that one question in that one cohort meeting, it would be taken on board if it was a good one, and it would shape and everything was kind of shaped around all this kind of creativity and progressive thinking that was coming in, that was set up from this massive foundation that Mike Fleetwood had kind of constructed.
Can I just say to that, Craig, that I don't think we at the time, all the students, fully, and again, it sounds trivial, that idea that the staff room was right in the middle of the studio. And when we were talking before with you and Paul, and you suddenly brought, Craig still got it, the brick. And the only time the door was closed was when there were times when we needed to have a real heart-to-heart with each other and talk about, so there he's got the brick. And the brick was kept the door open all the time. And the notion, I mean, it was unheard of that actually all the tutors would just be accessible. And they would be either out and if they were in the room, the door was open and you just barged in, and it was extraordinary. And again, that was Fleetwood. He insisted in the tutors being present right on the floor with the students.
On the shop floor, absolutely.
It would be titled student focused now. It wasn't kind of, that probably wasn't a term back then. Any other questions? Everybody want to kind of ask these guys a question? You can unmute yourself if you want to. I know we've overrun, but
there's a course tradition,
Yes,
overrunning.
Everybody here will remember the crits that would go on till 8 o'clock at night. Nods. Chris Jones, unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
I am here. I'm sorry I'm late. I had to bring my daughter from her performance. So hello, everyone. You haven't changed much apart from a few grey hairs.
Nice to see you, Chris.
But I'd just like to contribute towards that. And I just caught on from what Patrick's. Hello, Patrick, by the way. Long time no see. I think there was a very family-orientated atmosphere. And what I mean by that is it was very welcoming, or almost like a brotherhood. And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of people from the years back in the 90s when we were all there who are still in touch and still very close. And obviously, generations have gone since then, but there's a particular set of years which I think were extremely important and extremely good. There was a good crop of students who came out of it. And I think that was not just Mike's influence, but there's also Paul's, Patrick's, yourself, and it kind of bred a union, if you like, which felt like a family. And I don't know if you agree with that, but
yeah, well, I think I would say that thank God for email, because every year, I mean, we used to put we built up every year, had this alumni list, and we would tell every year when the next show was on and what was coming up. And it just built up. It was fantastic the way students responded. I mean, they would just come year after year to the shows and meet other students. And as you say, some years I can remember were particularly strong at keeping in touch with each other. But it also spread, and that's why we could, when we did close down the initial, when Paul and I left in 2011. I mean, the people who turned up in that third floor at that time, extraordinary. And thank God for email, because that's how it was just an amazing thing. We had every year all their emails, and we just keep in touch with everybody. And they still now. I'm still getting the emails coming now. It's wonderful. It's amazing.
It was a safe and supportive, and you mentioned the word trust, that environment, and you felt you belonged to it. But also, I would say that everybody had to work hard. The standards, you weren't expected to kind of slack off. And I think by the time you kind of got into that and everybody was kind of, working hard, by the time you finished, you felt like a whole massive kind of team, I think, because you'd worked so hard for it,
Yeah, I mean, I've got a memory of one particular year. I think I was, it was the summer break between I think it was the second year that we were on into the third year. And we'd just done the photographer's studio on the top floor. I hope you remember it, Patrick, which was a particularly good screen. My effort at it was appalling. And I think Patrick took me aside and said, look, go away for the summer and just concentrate on what you did. And I think I learned a lot from that. I don't know if that was mainly Patrick's influence on me. I couldn't put it to Mike, but You know, it was just one of those moments and people that will stick with you forever, really, in a certain period of time, which kind of shapes and influences your time moving forward into middle age, sadly. So yeah, and
I think also,
you know,
if I could add to that, that the thing that always struck me and why I think we had confidence that what we were doing was what you've just described, is when we used to introduce the course for the very first time to a student who'd never seen us before, and often with their parents, their response to the opening talk about this is what this course is about. And people just they were just wonderful. They kind of got it almost from the very first day, from that first content. And parents used to come up and said, that's the first time I've been to a university talk where I actually understand what on earth you're going to teach my son, my daughter. And it's crystal clear. And it sounds really exciting. And I hope you'll let my son or daughter come to the course. And it was just kind of really interesting in that way. And I think that was because all of us were just trying to be as clear and committed as we could and make that clear to the students and to the parents, you know. And once they decided to join us, it was, you know, a few people thought, oh God, I didn't realize it was going to be this hard. But most people actually just kind of thought, okay, yeah, you told us it was going to be tough, but here we go. Yeah.
Any other questions out there?
can I just ask a question of, I don't know how many people are out there at the moment, but I'd be interested to know if they got into the design world and actually stuck in it. My own experience, I did 20 years, or over 20 years, almost 30 years of architecture, and I've recently gone to the dark side.
Don't tell me you're a project manager.
I am a project manager. How did you guess, Patrick?
Don't worry, Adam Couch is another. And he's very good at it.
Well, I think it was, I had a calling and was persuaded to do it. So I made the jump. I could always jump back.
But it's great that you're a project manager, because you still know what design's about. So you won't be one of these project manager who hasn't got a clue what design architecture is about, but who only knows the cost of nothing, or whatever it is, the price of everything.
Yeah.
You will actually be sympathetic. You can talk to an architect or a designer with you, and you know what they're talking about. And
yeah, absolutely.
And they will know that you know.
I think, Chris, to answer your question, I think if you look at LinkedIn, because I'm kind of linked in with most of these people now, they're all doing something from the interior architecture course. I would say the majority of them are still in design, architecture, construction in some shape or form, judging by what they say in their profiles. So I think that's part of the legacy too, I would say.
I think a lot of people do shift into architecture practices. I think one of the issues is that probably all of the leading design studios are based perhaps in London or in Manchester. Certainly when we were doing the course, I don't know so much now. I mean, there might be more design studios in other cities, but there was such a kind of concentration, particularly in London at the time, that I think for people who didn't want to go to London and wanted to stay in Wales or close to where they lived, etc., then architecture seemed to be the best offer available, really, rather than going into design studios, which there's so few of. So, but I mean, I think people who've come out of that interior architecture experience actually deliver something very special into architectural practice. I think it is distinct. I don't think they're just shadowing architects in that sense. I think they bring a lot of understanding, particularly in terms of materials, especially in terms of kind of spatial understanding, and you know, tactility of design, etc. And also a kind of, I think a lot of them succeed because they really do understand how clients operate from the courses that we ran down in Cardiff. So I think even when they're within architectural companies, they do offer something very special and focused.
We'll bring that to a close, I think. I mean, thank you very much for everybody tuning up. Hope that was useful. We're planning on doing others with different kind of subjects. Remember that Interior Architecture Reunion Saturday in the evening of the 16th of August. So next month, it would be lovely to see you all there. But thank you very much for turning up. We'll put the recording out there so you can kind of access it and you can send it around the place as well. But thank you very much. And thank you, Patrick, Hannay and Paul Harris, for all your contributions. Take care, everyone.
Great to see you all.
Yeah, good to see
Thanks.
you. Take
Thanks a
care.
lot.
All the best. Okay, thanks, Craig.
Bye.
Thanks, Craig. Bye.
Bye.